This week we focus on existential social work. This strain of social work derives itself from the existentialist movement that took rise after World War II. So here we see some of the key figures in the development of these ideas. Rollo May, these are existential therapists. Viktor Frankl, Carl Jung, Gordon Allport, Abraham Maslow, Irvin Yalom, and Karen Horney. Certainly, during that time, their contemporaries were the existential philosophers of the 20th century, Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, who were associates. Martin Buber, who I've talked about earlier in the semester, wrote this wonderful book titled I and Thou. I encourage you to read some of his work as well. Albert Camus, who wrote The Stranger, which I think is a really nice story that encompasses these ideas around existentialism. Gabriel Marcel and Paul Tillich. Tillich was, I believe, a Lutheran theologian who also embraced the ideas of existentialism. Looking at the earliest writings that that I have found, although there may be older ones, is from the book of Ecclesiastes. In the 1960s, there was a group, I think they were the Byrds, they did a song called Turn, 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 based on this scriptural passage, which is kind of a nice overview or concept of what existentialism is about. It's sort of like balancing the yin and the yang. There's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time for mourning and a time for dancing, a time to tear and a time to mend. So basically, this is the idea that there's an opposite that we experience, birth and death as an example, that life is filled with, perhaps one might say, constant change. That's one thing we can be guaranteed of. And we have joy and we have sorrow. It's part of the experience of living. Again, modern existentialism was born in the ruins, chaos, and atmosphere of disillusionment in Europe during and following World War II. The whole Nazi genocide was such an absurd experience and such a horror that it raised many questions in terms of humanity and existence. So the term philosophy of despair, which is alluded to in terms of existentialism, partially because it seems to have emerged from a time of disillusionment. So disillusionment for a lot of people would lead to despair. There are four themes of existentialism. One, individual freedom and uniqueness of the person. Again, a very humanistic approach to therapy and philosophy. That suffering is a necessary part of the ongoing life process. It's just a given that at some point we're going to experience suffering. And then we'll experience times where we are not experiencing any existential or physical kinds of pain. So it's sort of like birth and death, suffering and not suffering. The emphasis on one's involvement in the immediate moment as a means of discovering one's identity and what life is about. And this is very much like a number of the Asian or Eastern philosophies or approaches, that to be present in the here and now keeps us from being in the past or the future, which may bring about some levels of anxiety and pain. So in order to reduce anxiety, one would be wanting to stay focused in the present, which isn't the easiest thing to do if you've ever tried it. And then a sense of commitment that seeks to maintain a life of discipline and spontaneity, contemplation, action, egolessness, and an emerging care for others. So there's again these balances: discipline, spontaneity, contemplation, action, egolessness, and emerging care for others. So again, balancing. There's a lot of balancing back and forth that goes on in life, and this sort of discusses that direction. There are a number of authors around these themes: Søren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, Henri Bergson, modern philosophers, Martin Heidegger, who was present and went through World War II. I believe he lived in Germany, and at some point he was somewhat favorable towards Hitler. Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Simone de Beauvoir, again, Martin Buber, Gabriel Marcel, and Paul Tillich, which we saw at the outset of the lecture today. And then psychologists Husserl, Binswanger, Boss, Viktor Frankl, Rollo May, and Irvin Yalom. So those are some of the people. And then additionally, Karen Horney, Carl Jung, Karl Mustakis, Carl Rogers, interestingly, who was also a humanist in his approach, Abraham Maslow, who developed the hierarchy of need, Gordon Allport, Andrus Agnall, and Prescott Leckie are the others that are listed in the literature. So looking at psychotherapy, which has implications for existential social work, here the social worker or therapist assumes that the patient experiences anxiety with issues from some existential conflict which is at least partially unconscious. So that's the first thing. There's some element of anxiety here that we're looking at. And that the majority of patients are bedeviled by a lack of meaning in their lives. So this concept of meaning and purpose in existentialism is very much tied in with what we might define as spirituality in contemporary society. Basically, spirituality has to do with how an individual finds meaning and purpose in their life and how they construct that. So basically, it's an existentialist approach to therapy, as we see here. So the process of psychotherapy. Each of the ultimate concerns, death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness, has its own implication for the process of therapy. One major component of freedom is responsibility, a concept that deeply influences the existential therapist's therapeutic approach until one realizes that he or she is responsible for her or his own condition. There is little motivation to change. So here, responsibility is a theme in terms of focus through a number of psychotherapies, and even later we find that in reality therapy, Glasser looks at responsibility as a central focus of what he does with the individuals he was working with. Again, the process. When patients say they can't do something, the therapist immediately comments, "You mean you won't do it?" So there's this unblocking of thinking here, that can't is not a word that is not in the lexicon of an existentialist therapist or social worker. The therapist encourages patients to own their feelings and statements in action. And here we get to looking at how our focus and feelings are really a choice based on how we experience reality around us. The decision-making is blocked by obstacles, and it's the therapist's task to help remove obstacles. So you see here, can't is juxtaposed by you won't, thereby trying to unblock the thinking. And in some cases, some of the work you may do may be like the Taoist idea of directing. One does not go direct on with the issue. In other words, you don't confront it directly, but you angle around it by utilizing other ways of construing or looking at reality. So, someone says, "I can't." Well, rather than saying, "What do you mean you can't?" you would say, "You mean you won't do it." So that shifts, again, thinking. An important element of therapy, whether you're an existentialist or not. And then death and psychotherapy. There are two ways the concept of death plays an important role in existential psychotherapy. An increased awareness of one's finiteness stemming from a personal confrontation with death may cause a radical shift in life perspective and lead to personal change. And I know from my own experience this happened when I was near death on a couple of occasions in 2008. It seemed when I came out of that illness and recovered, things that used to bother me, that I used to get upset about, no longer mattered anymore, because in the long perspective, it really had little to do with my long-term existence or happiness. just one example. There are many that you can find in the literature. And the concept that death is a primary source of anxiety has many important implications for therapy. A lot of this idea of fearing death. For those who've had a near-death experience, fear is often not any longer present because there's a sense that the transition to the other side is not going to be all that confusing or frightful, as an example. And a little later I'll do a slide presentation on spiritual emergency, and one of the emergencies is the near-death experience, which I will discuss briefly. And then this idea of death and grief. The literature on grief focuses on two aspects of grief work: the experience of the loss and the resolution of ambivalence, which is so strongly in terms of accentuating the dysphoria of grief. So, sort of this love-hate, anger, getting to some sort of level of understanding. Grief is difficult for many people, and as well as the loss. And so in the strengths perspective, one would look at, were there other losses in life, and how were they able to negotiate those? And what are all of the factors surrounding the loss? Was there a long-term caregiving experience that went on? Say someone had Alzheimer's for 10 years, and the person has developed a lot of shame and anger about how they treated the individual, or that the individual left them. There's just a range of things in terms of what all this ambivalence can include. And so it really accentuates this dysphoria, especially guilt. And so a lot of times loss is enfolded in this guilt kind of thing that therapists will work with individuals to let go of and move on. And again, the Buddhist notion of attachment would be an interesting element here too, although they were not part of, in terms of the Buddhist approach, the existentialist development that I'm aware of just post-World War II. There were a lot of Asian ideas that came into the United States, for instance, in the late 1960s during the Vietnam War, and Asian therapies became more prevalent, or awareness of such. Today we find mindfulness is one that's used a lot in therapy. So the issue of anxiety. Basically, life cannot be lived, nor can death be faced without some level of anxiety. So again, anxiety has to do with not being in the here and now, doesn't it? Because anxiety is about something that happened in the past, or anticipation of what's going to happen in the future. So this anxiety could potentially be helped with the use of mindfulness therapies as well. But in terms of existentialism, this is the take on anxiety. And then milestones such as births or anniversaries are useful levers. For instance, these signs of passage are often capable of eliciting pain. I didn't think I'd ever be this old. Or anniversaries of the death of individuals, particularly if they're around holidays, can be very painful for family members. And then this sense of isolation, which even grows greater as we move into the 21st century. Patients discover in therapy that through interpersonal relationships, they may temper isolation. They cannot eliminate it. And in one way or another, some people do not relate to or love another person, but instead use another person to avoid some of the pain accompanying isolation. So the fear of being alone means that you attach immediately after each relationship to someone else, no matter what they may bring you, whether it's pain or not. And that can continue. It becomes kind of a cycle until one discovers what's going on and what the fear of isolation is. Certainly, as we do research in social work, we find social support is a critical part of people in terms of their improving their ways of looking at things and healing from various experiences. So, this interpersonal sense of isolation really speaks also of this need for some element of social support, but also addressing whatever one's experiences at what they might call the emptiness inside. And so then, of course, we move to this idea of meaninglessness. And of the existential therapists, I like all of them, but I really have a fondness for Viktor Frankl and his work. He placed a great emphasis on the importance of meaninglessness in psychopathology and stated that happiness cannot be pursued, it can only ensue. In other words, I want to be happy. He didn't see happiness as a goal because it's transitional. As an existentialist, we would know that because you can be happy and then sometimes you're going to be sad. But it can happen based on one's own going through life. Frankl suggested that the more we deliberately search for self-satisfaction, the more it eludes us, whereas the more we find some self-transcendent meaning, the more happiness will ensue. So, self-satisfying, does not bring one to a place of happiness. It's very fleeting, as we know. We buy something, it's good for a bit, and then we lose interest, as opposed to something that ensues that is more lasting in terms of our way of approaching things. Frankl suggested that this means some patients must be helped to take their gaze off themselves. That is, some patients must be helped in the process of what he called de-reflection, and I believe he was the first one to use this term, where you move the person away from focusing on self to focusing on someone else or something else, or some other process that they may be able to work on or toward some goal. So application, an existentialist approach to therapy is much more obviously appropriate with patients who confront some boundary situation. That is, a confrontation with death, the facing of some important irreversible decision they have to make, a sudden thrust into isolation, for instance the death of a spouse, milestones which mark passages from one life era to the next. For instance, middle age to old age, this whole area around retirement, it can be a real challenge in terms of a boundary because one moves from having a routine every day to an open schedule, which can be very troubling for many people. Indeed, these boundary periods of life also open the possibility for working with individuals around rites of passage, which is another approach that one might use in therapy to help people transition between periods of life, to bridge those periods as they move into the next stage. So logotherapy, which is Viktor Frankl's approach to therapy. In Man's Search for Meaning, he writes the first rather detailed approach to logotherapy. And again, it's like meaning therapy. Logo has to do with finding meaning and purpose. So freedom will involve, the freedom of will involves determinism. The will to meaning is discussed as distinct from the concepts of the will to power and the will to pleasure as they are presented by Adler and Freud. So this is a difference between him and Freud and Adler. He discusses the will to meaning versus power and pleasure, which are in the other therapeutic approaches. So again, we're looking here at meaning and purpose. That's the central element of what one would be working with in terms of logotherapy. And the meaning of life relates to the issue of relativism versus subjectivism. So those are the elements that Frankl talks about in terms of logotherapy. And again, application, children leaving home and the empty nest feeling of the parent, retirement, we've talked a little bit about these transitions, career failure, marital separation, divorce, or major physical illness are all elements that bring up these boundary issues and the ambivalence that one is thrown into. Therapy needs to be limited to these more explicit existential crises. So if you're doing existential work, it fits best with these kinds of issues that people may be presenting. The existential approach fulfills two major needs of modern social work practice. First, it is the only social work approach that emphasizes the value issues related to the client's problem. So whatever the values are related to the problem is emphasized in this approach. And the existential view of clients and their problems bridges the gap in current social work theory between the intrapsychic emphasis on the one hand psychodynamic approaches, and the behavioral systemic emphasis on the other, which is more about controlling behavior, the cognitive behavioral work, versus the more emotive existential spiritual work that one might connect with existentialism, particularly logotherapy. Loosely could be considered spiritual in that it's a search for meaning and purpose that we are assisting people to deal with. Frankl again states that each person has a mission in life and only he or she can complete that mission. So that's a really important thought as we work with people, because this whole mission idea really suggests meaning and purpose, because once we embrace our mission and work and complete it, we truly have found the meaning and purpose of our lives. It's really locked into not only an inward sort of experience, but what it is that we bring to the world, how we transform the world around us or in a much larger way. So some of the references here, Corsini's Current Psychotherapies, which is 2000 was the 6th edition. There's a newer edition, I'm sure, since then. Francis Turner's Social Work, Treatment, Interlocking Theoretical Approaches. I believe it has a newer edition, however, it hasn't been revised in some time. This is a quick overview of existentialism, and you'll also find some videos around the various authors and theorists that discuss this approach to social work and psychotherapy.